This is the sharpest 35mm lens that Canon has ever made. The RF 35mm f1.4 VCM is an interesting lens, and I think for most photographers, you're either gonna love it or hate it. Now, after about 3 months of using it and taking it with me on photo adventures, I think it's finally time to talk about some of the advantages, the disadvantages, compare it to the 35mm f1.8, and talk about whether or not this is a lens that I plan to keep. I will say that I'm less excited about this lens specifically than I am about the idea that this lens represents, but I'll talk about what I mean by that in a little bit. A lot of the early reviewers that gave their first impressions of this lens kind of repeated the same talking points, one of the big ones being the floating element. Now, that means that there are a bunch of glass elements in here that are kind of just floating around, and so when you move the lens, you can feel it moving around, and you've probably seen a lot of the reviewers do things like this, where they shake the lens and you can hear it moving. Now, in practice, I don't know about you, but I'm not shaking my lens. Most of the time it's just attached to my camera, and realistically, in practice, you don't notice that it's moving unless you're running or you're aggressively shaking your lens, which I actually don't recommend that you do. The other big one is the distortion correction. And yes, this lens does have distortion, it does have vignetting, and I think for most photographers, for most video shooters, in most shooting scenarios, this really isn't that big of an issue. But there is one condition that I would recommend being careful, and that is low light photography. So I wanted to test this lens with some astrophotography, which is probably not the recommended use case for a 35mm lens. Like, you probably want a 24 or a 16 or maybe even an 85 with a star tracker. But if we take a look at this photo, this is how I exposed it. So if we look, 10 seconds, f1.4, 3200 ISO. So pretty high ISO so that we could see everything, probably a little bit overexposed than what I would normally do. I think normally I like my astro to be around this, so I'm not blowing out the highlights. But one of the challenges is that if you shoot like this and you start to raise the exposure, which means a lot of the noise is gonna start to be more apparent. And what you can actually notice in the corners is, even though if we scroll down, you can see that the distortion corrections are applied. So if I turn it off, that is what it looks like without. Now, that is maybe like, I don't know, a third or a half of a stop of a vignette. Like, that is a very significant vignette. And so what's happening is when we apply profile corrections, it is actually boosting the exposure even more and making the noise and the grain and all of that information in the corner that we maybe don't want to see more apparent. So if I go back to this other one that I exposed correctly, you can see, again, there's what the profile corrections looks like. And if I go up and boost my exposure, to me, this might be hard to see on YouTube, but I feel like the noise is more apparent here than it is in the middle. Same thing up here. It's more apparent in the corners than it is in the center of the frame. Now, depending on how you shoot your astro, maybe you are stacking multiple photos and you can reduce that noise. But for some shooting scenarios in low light, if you are applying those corrections, that noise can become more apparent, and that's really when it does become a problem. However, in other scenarios, like these portraits that I have over here, so this was shot during blue hour, and you can kind of see that there is no apparent vignetting, and that's because all of those corrections have been applied. But if I go down to here again, and I say, let's remove it, you can see that there's a significant vignette. But in this case, because I'm shooting kind of a normal exposure, ISO 500, I can zoom into the corners and I can look at the noise and go, okay, kind of looks normal. I did boost the exposure on this. Compared to the center of the frame, it really doesn't look that bad. So that vignetting isn't really going to be an issue. Now, the distortion itself might be. I think for this photo, I would happily turn it off because there's no straight lines that I'm dealing with. It's all just nature and trees and rocks. So if I go back to 0, it's like either way, whether it's on or off, it really doesn't make a difference. And I think for those of you who are interested in shooting portraits, or maybe you're interested in shooting weddings, and 99% of what you do is in daylit conditions where you don't have to worry about the vignetting ruining the noise because you've boosted to 6400 ISO, I think in your case, this is a lens that's for you. Not to mention the fact that having f1.4 is a significant advantage over f1.8 and even f2.8. Now in my case, my 15 to 35 is my main lens that I bring with me. I'm actually shooting on it right now. But there is a massive difference between f2.8 and f1.4, so much that it feels like you have a superpower. Like the fact that I can shoot this 1/200, f1.4, ISO 500, and it's dark out, like the sun has gone down. I'm just getting a little bit of a reflection, a little bit of light. Like if I go to this one, you can see that there's a sunset. This one, I lowered my shutter speed to 1/50, and then I raised my ISO to ISO 3200. Actually, if I go to the uncropped version, this is where you can see there's really not a big issue with the noise in the corner. Yes, it's noisy because I was shooting at 3200 ISO, but I'm shooting on the Canon R5 with 45 megapixels. When I zoom out to a normal zoom viewing distance for this photo, you really don't notice any of that. If I go back into 100%, you can see the advantages of f1.4, or maybe the disadvantages depending how you view this. But the focus plane, I believe, focused just past these Meta Ray-Bans that I'm wearing, kind of maybe in this zone right here, and you get that really thin sliver of f1.4, that really shallow depth of field. That is the advantage of f1.4 over an f2.8 or even an f1.8. For a lot of photographers, this is going to be a one and done lens, meaning 35 covers a lot of different types of photography. It's wide enough to shoot landscapes if you want to. It is tight enough to shoot portraits, probably not as tight as something like a 70 to 200. That is still the type of lens that I'd recommend if you're doing something like weddings and you need that reach, or you're doing an event, or you're doing landscapes and you want to reach out and get those details. But if you're someone who is a video shooter or a hybrid shooter, like Canon says in the literature, this is a lens that makes a lot of sense and is one of the main reasons I am super excited about this lens and the direction that Canon is heading. Now, if you are a cinema shooter, a filmmaker, someone who just does video, and maybe you shoot on a C400 or one of those big cinema cameras, more than likely this is not a lens for you. More than likely you have your set of prime lenses, you're manually focusing everything. But if you are someone who shoots on a mirrorless camera, an R5, an R6, an R8, or even something like a C70 or a C80, that's when a lens like this that has built-in autofocus makes a lot of sense. It also has the aperture ring, which one of the disadvantages being it doesn't have full functionality on some of the older cameras. So that is something to keep in mind if this is a lens you look at and you go, I really want a manual aperture ring. Unfortunately, make sure you check which model of camera you're using because it doesn't work on all of them. As I mentioned at the beginning of the video, the sharpness and the detail of this lens is really what's impressive. Here is a 100% crop of this Lexus GX. I shot it at f3.5, again, because I want to try and get as much of the car in focus as possible. I want the front of the car, the back of the car, and I'm shooting a little bit farther away. You might notice a little bit of noise if I zoom in to 200%, and that is because I used some masking to kind of boost the shadow section of the car. So that's what it looked like originally. That's what it looks like after. And then here is another view where it was a slightly longer exposure, 5 seconds, f3.5, ISO 100, and we were getting nice sharp edges around the contours of this vehicle. Keeping in mind, we are zoomed into 200%. So if I zoom out to 100%, again, that's what it looks like. And again, because this is an R5, that is a 45 megapixel, so we can really zoom in and get lots of nice sharp detail. Now, Canon is calling this lens a hybrid lens, which I think is kind of misleading because it almost implies that there's going to be a non-hybrid lens, and there very well might be. There very well might be an f1.2 35mm lens, which I think Canon should make, but if you're someone who is holding out for a non-hybrid f1.4, I would say probably don't. Like, this is the lens that we're probably going to expect to see in this f-stop range and in this focal length range probably for the next couple of years. And I know for some people that's going to be a bummer because they look at a lens like this and they go, I can't have any digital correction. I can't have that much distortion, that much vignetting. Now, for most people, like I mentioned, if you are shooting on a Canon camera, all of this is adjusted in camera. The one instance where this might actually be a problem is if you are a red cinema shooter. So if you shoot on a red Komodo, as you know, you can attach RF lenses to that camera and they function, but as far as I know, there is no way to do any of that vignetting correction or any of that distortion correction in camera. So a lens like this on something like a red cinema camera probably doesn't make that much sense. But here's another set of photos that I shot during Blue Hour at f1.4, because if you have an f1.4, you might as well use it. So we are shooting at Bixby Bridge. You see the landscape is all nice and blurred out in the background on the Canon R5 Mark II, and I do believe it got the front eye here of Dana in this case. Zooming out, it's a very light edit, so I didn't edit this photo too much. There's before, there's after. That should be using my Rustic Dawn preset. So if I boost that, you can see we're gonna be desaturating the blues a little bit more, kind of making those skin tones pop. And then if I go to a photo of me, same sort of deal. So here is 100%, you can see all of the details in my skin. It grabbed that first eye, and then because it's f1.4, it falls off. The ear is not in focus, so depending on how you like your portraits, sometimes it's nice to have the front of the nose to the back of the ear in focus, so maybe this case you could bump it up to like f2.8 just to get all of that. But again, we have f1.4, we are shooting in Blue Hour conditions. That is the real advantage of having a lens like this. But if I go to this photo that I shot of Lee, so this was the same Rustic Dawn preset, and f1.4, 1/100. Keep in mind, this lens doesn't have image stabilization. So one of the things you might notice is there is a little bit of motion blur in some of the details in this photo. It's not quite as sharp as the other photo of me that you just saw. And again, that's because we're on the edge of the cliff. There's a little bit of a wind. I'm probably shaking a little bit. You know, maybe Lee is moving a little bit. And so when you put all those factors together, no image stabilization, just the in-body image stabilization, sometimes that is a little bit of a disadvantage. When you compare it to something like the 35 f1.8, which does have image stabilization, mind you, you'd probably have to go down from 1/100 to maybe like 1/80 or 1/50 just to maintain the same amount of light. So there are those trade-offs. In some cases, having the more wider aperture to let more light in is going to be an advantage, and then in other cases having the image stabilization will be an advantage. But if we do a more direct comparison, so here is what the framing looks like with profile corrections applied on the f1.4 VCM. So pay attention to the edges of the frame. Okay, now I'm going to switch to the f1.8. You'll notice it's a little bit tighter. Obviously our shutter speed has changed to maintain the same amount of brightness, the same amount of exposure. Now, if I go into the Develop tab and we turn off, this is where everything gets really interesting. If I turn off profile corrections, so that is what the original 35 f1.8 looks like. There is an amount of vignetting, there is an amount of distortion. The framing doesn't change too much, but you can see kind of that bowing, that pin cushioning effect on the side. Okay, back to the f1.4. Now, if I turn this one off, that's where you can really notice that change in perspective. It's like it almost gains an extra 3 or 4 millimeters of focal length because of all of the corrections that are being applied. So for some people, this might be a huge disadvantage. Maybe you're someone because of the type of photography that you use, you just can't use profile corrections. I'm gonna say that's a very small percentage of people, and I think the thing that Canon has done here is that every time they come up with a new lens, the way it works is they develop several different optical formulas. They look at optical formula A and optical formula B, they test them and they go, okay, which one is gonna produce the better image quality for the price, or the better image quality after all the things that need to be done to it? And I think what Canon has decided here is that profile corrections, profile transformations, digital corrections inside of Lightroom or inside of the camera have gotten good enough, and the sharpness of sensors and the resolutions that we're dealing with have gotten good enough that the trade-off is basically equivalent. Meaning that they probably had a different lens design at some point that didn't have as much optical distortion. But when they compared it to the formula that they ended up going with, this formula was, one, probably cheaper, probably lighter, so that they can offer the end user an overall better product. And if it means that all you really have to do is click one button to enable profile corrections and you're getting a sharper overall image, then why not? And that's where I default to. This lens is good for 90% of photographers in 90% of shooting scenarios. For some photographers, if vignetting and distortion correction is a problem, then honestly, the 35 f1.8 is probably the better lens for you. Or if you're someone who needs a super close minimum focusing distance, this lens has macro capabilities and is honestly the main reason that I still own and use this lens. A lot of the time, I need to do close-up detail shots of products or the back of my screen so I can show you the camera settings that I'm using, and the 35 f1.8 is the lens that I'm using. Comparing images from both of these lenses side by side, I will say that the 35 f1.4 VCM is probably about 20% sharper, depending on the types of images that you're shooting and depending on the aperture setting that you're shooting at. But it is 3 times more expensive. So is a 3 times cost more expensive worth that extra 15-20% in sharpness gain? It might not be, but if you're a video shooter, the autofocus on this lens is way faster than the autofocus on the 35. The 35, the STM, the stepping motors, these lenses are typically a lot slower than what you get with a lot of these L series lenses. Now, I will say for me, as someone who often carries the 15 to 35 f2.8, that has overlap with this lens. And so one of the decisions that I have to make is that overlap something that I want to live with? Is it worth me bringing another lens for those instances where I need a few extra stops of light? Now, last year I tried the Canon RF 50mm f1.2, and that was a lens that I thoroughly enjoyed. That lens would have less overlap and probably makes more sense to pair with something like the 15 to 35. But that lens is quite old at this point, and one of the things that I found while testing it is that it wasn't as fast as some of the Sony options, or it wasn't as fast as some of the newer RF L series lenses. And so for me, if Canon had come out with a 50mm f1.4 that was maybe smaller than the 1.2 and faster because it now uses the VCM voice coil motors, I believe that's what it stands for, that would probably be the lens that I would opt to keep over the 35. Or in my case, because I do like to shoot astrophotography, having something like a 15 or a 16 or a 14mm f1.4 like what Sigma has is a very much needed addition to the Canon RF lens lineup. But it might also just be an unnecessarily massive lens that no one wants to carry around. But if you want to see my video on the 50mm or on the 35mm, I'll link both of those right here. And until the next one, grab your camera, grab your lenses, get out, and go shoot photos.